All right, we got the next episode lecture today. Continuing on bias. There we go. Got my screen shared. And we're going to talk about bias. All right, so we're picking up from the last lecture. Bias, fallacies. Those are ways that we measure conversation. So there's an if-then, or there's an object and an effect. So we have to grab those things to make any sense of them. So the way that we do that is communication, and the way that we communicate is by measurement. So fallacies are bad math, bad mathematical structure, false equivalence, saying 1 is equal to 2, saying that division by 0 is okay, that sort of thing. That's a fallacy. Built into the process is something that breaks it before it's allowed to even try to do what it does. It's like a birth defect. It's not viable as an idea that can stand on its own. It needs to pull outside resources from somewhere or someone in the form of agreement or validation or concession so that it can become, a fully stable idea. So a fallacy is something that ignores part of the construction of the idea. And a bias is something that ignores one of the results. So there are different ways of ignoring things. A fallacy ignores construction and logic, and a bias ignores results. So if you really want to get down to it. So now we're going to just go through these. Base rate fallacy, the tendency to ignore general information and focus on information only pertaining to the specific case, even when the general information is more important. Yeah, that's denying data, because the stories that you want to talk about are the better stories that make your point. And it makes your point harder to make when you look at cases that aren't the one you're looking at to prove it. That's what that bias is, the tendency to not want to do that. Compassion fade, the tendency to behave more compassionately towards a small number of individual identifiable victims than to a large number of anonymous ones. Yeah, that's why they don't do stories on the news about a lot of people dying. Like beyond a certain point, you'll see there's a cutoff. The number of names that they can list on a screen and have you read in 10 seconds, that's the cutoff for how big those groups of people that they'll report on the news with a very heavy heart, with a very thoughts and prayers sort of approach, with a exaggeration on the humanity. And then when you get to the stories like the bombing of this, that, or the other thing, the 100 people who died, especially if they have names that are hard to pronounce, from our group of the world, which goes from every spot in the world to every other spot in the world where names are done differently. So that's not just a Western thing. That is anywhere you are from anywhere you aren't type of relationship as far as that goes. The farther away they are, the less familiar they are, the larger those numbers can be, and that's compassion fade. The conjunction fallacy, the tendency to assume that specific conditions are more probable than a general version of those same conditions. Yeah, that's it's always like that when I got here. That's my table. That's my, I always sit in that table, so it's always going to be open. Or, let's see, assume that specific conditions are more probable than a more general version of those same conditions. Yeah, it just ignores too many things. It's ignoring possibilities that are possible. Duration neglect, the neglect of the duration of an episode in determining its value. Yeah, it works, but for how long? How long will it continue to work? What is the cost of it working? When does it fail? Ignoring that because it makes the argument weaker. That's duration neglect. Hyperbolic discounting, where discounting is the tendency for people to have a stronger preference for more immediate payoffs relative to later payoffs. Hyperbolic discounting leads to choices that are inconsistent over time. You make a choice today that your future self would prefer you have not. So it's more along the lines of what have you done for me lately? And I can't think that far into the future, therefore I can't act like it exists. So short-term thinking, and you run into this when people disagree with each other. Often it is the duration of time they can imagine and the level of complexity that they can imagine being a part of their choice. The insensitivity to sample size, the tendency to under-expect variation in small samples. Yeah, if you don't have a big enough group for your testing, you could be getting bad data, and you probably are, which is a different way of saying you are not getting average data, because average data is a function of sample size. So you can't have a small group of people that is very highly selected and expect to get an average result. No, you are engineering a bias, which in some cases is exactly what you want to do. Say you only are interested in genetically modifying something that is responsible for a genetic condition. Well, you only want people with that genetic condition to take that treatment because everyone else would be either harmed by it or unaffected. So there's a time and a place to bias the sample size, but it is not when it comes to making broad conclusions about the behavior or preferences of a thing. Less is better effect, tendency to prefer a small set to a larger set, judge separately but not jointly. Yeah, it's simpler, that's why. Easier to understand, as if somehow simplicity had anything to do with causality. That's not how any of that works. The neglect of probability, the tendency to completely disregard probability when making a decision under uncertainty. Yeah, oh, we can't know. We can't know until we try. Well, what are the odds? Well, never tell me the odds. That's the neglect of probability. It's the we can't know for sure, even though you can probably get a pretty good guess ahead of time. And if you're trying to do any kind of measurement scientifically, the point of taking a measurement is to see if it matches a guess that you're making, even if that guess is really bad, because measuring a bad guess from anything else other than itself will give you a distance of how far you are off. So participation is better than nothing, except when you operate under the neglect of probability, because that completely discounts the ability of the human being to simulate and plan ahead. So yeah, that's neglect of probability. That's a lack of fourth dimensional time awareness. Scope neglect, scope insensitivity. Yeah, for example, being willing to pay 2,000 as much to save 2,000 children or 20,000 children. That's what they have. So you're not, you look at the problem and decide how much that problem is worth rather than look at that problem and measure how much it would take to fix it. So you put a price cap on how much mental investment is going to go into it. So next one, the zero risk bias, the preference for reducing a small risk to zero over a greater reduction in a larger risk. Yeah, that's the COVID vaccine. There's a lot of ways to measure risk, and we measured the capacities to survive that disease as the highest metric by which we took all action. And there is no argument that other metrics, which were not that one, were not designed to run under a system like that and suffered as a result. So the economy did not do well. Inflation did not do well. Public sentiment, public health did not do well. Those sorts of things. Mental health took a dive as a result in many sectors, suicide rates, etc. However, when it came to maximizing the people who would come into contact with the disease and survive, that was the focus. You can argue whether or not that was effective on your own, but that was the focus and the goal. So anything else that happened is to be understood as a cost of doing business. It's a yes and. It is a lesser evil measurement. So you have to remember to include all of the evil that is present when you're talking about the lesser of two evils, including the amount of evil your side has, because to prove that it's less, you need to be able to give a comprehensive list of it rather than avoid talking about it at all. That's that's that bias. So now we're going to do a bias is based on false priors, agent detection, the inclination to approve the purposeful intervention of a sentiment or intelligent agent. Now, let me get that definition there because I want to make sure I got it right. The inclination is for animals to presume the purposeful of the sentient. may or may not involve one. Oh, okay, I got it. So agent detectives, you're looking for the grand master behind everything. So I'm not going to listen to you because there's a secret hand stirring that pot. Maybe there is. Automation bias, the tendency to depend excessively on automated systems, which can lead to erroneous automated information overriding correct decisions. Yeah, that's the way we've always done it. That can be mechanical, that can be computer, or if you got somebody who's really old school, that could be your ideologues. You know, you're not going to meet two people who are hard enough social justice people who have a different list of things that they're allowed to say. You gotta have the same stance on certain things to be a part of that group. That's automation bias when it comes to ideology, because that's how they define the group. You don't get to be in the group if you don't have that part of it. Hey, what's up, brother? Join us in progress. Having a great time talking about bias. We made it up to gender bias. So are we good on audio visual, my friend? You got full confirmation?
Yes.
All right, good to see you. Okay, so gender bias, the set of implicit biases that discriminate against a gender. For example, the assumption that women are less suited to jobs requiring high intellectual ability. Oh, that's interesting. Failed verification on the citation there. I don't care what that means because that's just a type of bias. And that statement is a type of bias as well. So I'm just going to lump all of that into my overall explanation of that. Or the assumption that people or animals are male in the absence of any indicators of gender. Gender bias. You know, there's a lot of stuff that goes along with that. And most of it has a lot to do with how you feel about the genders. So rather than view this as some sort of outside scale that could be infinitely skewed to perfectly match with some sort of skewed perspective, I'm going to set the arbitrary scale that a gendered person is a human being with the potential to explore the entire human spectrum, and any sort of patterns that you feel develop as a reaction to that spectrum are going to be a reflection of your gender bias. And if enough of those patterns overlap with enough of other people's overlap, then the gender bias is given life as more of a general observation. So it becomes an average. So the whole sensitivity around gender bias as a whole, it's just talking about those averages as they pop up here and there and change over time, because that's what that is. We make that. It's part of our sociology. The sexual over-perception bias, the tendency to underestimate sexual interest of another person in oneself, or the sexual under-perspective bias, the tendency to underestimate it. Yeah, you see that a lot with people who are very sensitive to that sort of language, and they always think that it's an attack on them. You can't even say certain words. You know, it's worse than a nun on Good Friday in Mass, the type of topics that they're comfortable talking about. And so if they see something that has that flavor, operating with those assumptions would result in their imagination over-sexualizing it to the point of caricature, because they have not explored the topic well enough to understand what a proper integrated view, which is aware of a sexual potential but balances it with all of the other relevant information as well, and translates that into confidence of ego in certain situations, rather than a provocative invitation for mating. So that's how that desire interpretation can get twisted up with the individual who's experiencing it. Is they don't understand how it works, so they assume it's working badly. And if it looks sexy and I don't like sexy, then it's bad. That's the over-sexualization bias. That's the people talking about, well, what kind of access to certain information kids should have in kindergarten. Those kids ain't thinking about that stuff. They're still trying to figure out the swing set and whose turn it is at the fountain and how to handle it when somebody bumps into them and takes their milk. You know, that's what they're thinking about. The parents are the ones thinking about all this other stuff. And by introducing the concept, their level of concern skewed in one direction is providing them a skewed perspective exclusively with nothing else to balance it on because they don't have the life experience. So you want to see fucked up kids, have kids learn about sex from strangers in a class setting if you want to have fucked up kids, and don't do anything else, because every person who hasn't come to terms with their own sexuality is just going to be breeding dysfunction. But enough of that. That's a different lecture to go into why that is true. But stereotyping, expecting a member of a group to have certain characteristics without having actual information about that individual. Yeah, that's like me saying, I love me a white toast and mayonnaise sandwich, and I'm going to have a taco with mostly sour cream. You know, those are like white stereotypes, not very good ones. We don't have the most exciting stereotypes. Now we do. I always thought cracker was a good one. Like it rides that line pretty good between potentially satisfying and nourishing, or just, you know, the maker of crumbs. You know, it's you could go either way if you're a cracker. So I just try to be a good one, decent flavor, maybe some toasting on the outside. The framing effect. The framing effect is a tendency to draw different conclusions from the same information depending on how that information is presented. Form of the framing effect include, okay, so framing effect is one of those things where it's a measurement tool. They're describing duality. They're describing 1 + 1 = 3. They're describing, look at the thing, look at the opposite of thing, look at the spectrum that thing creates as a whole, and then find your spot on that spectrum. Now, what they're showing by framing it in the context of a bias is when that is done to avoid the larger conversation. So intent has a lot to do with this. Remember, these are points that are being made with the framing effect, points of comparison. So when you have a point and you're trying to talk about what that point means, you have to measure direction over time. So if somebody is using a framing effect and they are trying to get closer to your point of view, that is a positive use of these techniques. If you are using a framing effect, or someone is using a framing effect and they are trying to avoid your point of view, then it's a bias. So the direction determines whether this is a good measurement or a bad measurement. Closer to or further from, which is a measurement that the human mind is capable of making when it views things over time, including these framing effects. So I'm going to talk about these in terms of their potential for misuse, but remember that each of these, used in the proper setting, is the right answer to get closer to someone's point of view. But you have to recognize it is the right answer and not going to take you further away. The contrast effect, the enhancement or reduction of certain stimuli perception when compared with a recently observed contrasting object. So yeah, it's the bright, shiny new thing. It's the, whoa, we've never thought about that before. So we're going to throw away 500 years of knowledge on this because this one thing happened that looks different. We're going to turn it into either or instead of yes and. So that's the contrast effect right there. Decoy effect, where either A or B change in favor of option B when option C is presenting, which is completely dominated by option B, inferior in all respects, and partially dominated by option A. That's a crazy way of saying you put something out there that is so weak by comparison that the only reason it's there is so you will choose the thing that is next to it. It's the ugly wingman, the take one for the team kind of guy. You are of adequate and moderate appearance, but you have a very ugly friend who is loyal, and that person stands next to you and makes you look slightly more attractive by comparison. That is the decoy effect. If you have friends who are very self-aware, it's a good way to use that and to have them help you if they are so inclined. The default effect, the tendency to favor the default option when given the choice between several options. Yeah. You know what? I like the default effect, mostly because it's what happens when you didn't fuck around with it. So the decoy effect is good, or the default effect is good when you haven't done anything yet. You need a baseline measurement. You need to measure what this thing is without you. So yes, don't change the default settings, but don't stop there. Like that is step one. You know, most people get to the default setting and they're like, that machine runs. Why? Well, I don't know. I hit the button. Okay. And you're right. But what happens when you change all them settings? I don't know. Well, what happens when it breaks down? Well, we hit it a few times and then it starts back up. Well, what if you mess with the buttons? Well, we don't know what they do. So the default effect is the good enough is the enemy of great, is the enemy of progress sort of thinking. We don't need to do better because we have it good enough right now. Denomination effect, the tendency to spend more money when it is denominated in smaller amounts. Yeah, I don't break 100 because as soon as I do, it's gone. The distinction bias, the tendency to view two options as more dissimilar when evaluating them simultaneously than when evaluating them separately. Well, that's kind of what people do. Consciousness is a comparison machine. So anything you put next to itself or to something else is going to get a comparison, which is why the decoy effect is good when you're dating, when you're single, wingman. Logical fallacy. So now we're back to some fallacy biases. The Bergson's paradox, the tendency to misinterpret statistical experiments involving conditional probabilities. Yeah, you don't explain what is actually causing the thing. It's a blindness to the connections. The escalation of commitment, irrational exclamation or escalation, sunken cost fallacy. People justify increased investment in the decision based on cumulative prior investment. Yeah, it's like I'm in too deep. I've already spent this much money on. I can't walk away from this because.
I've got a good one for that.
What's that?
It's don't spend more time with your mistake just because you spent a lot of time making it.
Yeah, absolutely. Or money. Or emotional anger because you won't forgive that person for the last 30 years. The gambler's fallacy, we covered that one in my last one on fallacy, so we're going to skip that one. The hot hand fallacy, a belief that a person who has experienced success with a random event has a greater chance of success in additional attempts. Maybe. You don't know. The fallacy is when you make the assumption without looking into it. Maybe they do have a system. Maybe they got lucky. You got to find out which is which. You can't just assume. But if something happens to the same guy 5 times, well, you got to assume there's something going on. Makes me wonder about that guy that got hit by lightning 3 times in his life. And then after he died, lightning struck his gravestone. That's a true story. Something about that guy and lightning. Illicit transference occurs when a term in the distributive and collective sense are treated as equivalent. So that refers to every member of a class and the class itself as a whole. So that means that all Black people are the same Black person, is what illicit transference is saying. All Asian people are the same Asian person. All basketball players are the same basketball person. All farmers are the same farmer. It doesn't work. So you can't say that if this is true about 500 farmers, that it's true about you, who is also a farmer as well. You can't do that. It doesn't work in that direction. You can guess. There's a chance, but you got to take that into account. You can't just assume it's there. Oh, people will buy my blank. Yeah, that's illicit transference right there, all over the place. And it's powered by your hopes and dreams. Plan continuation bias, failure to recognize that the original plan of action is no longer appropriate for a changing situation. Yeah, that's being stuck in a bad path. Hey, circumstances have evolved. Your plan needs to evolve to include those circumstances. If it cannot, then yeah, you're just stuck in your ways. The sub-adity effect, the tendency to judge the probability of the whole to be less than the probability of the parts. Yeah, you run into that one. That one's tricky because that one actually goes in two directions. There's probably another bias that complements this one. But the tendency to judge the value of two sides of an equation, one being greater than the other, is present in both directions. And the real value comes in recognizing both and understanding their relationship to each other, far more than it comes from understanding either to the exclusion of the other. There's no amount of half of a thing that you can learn that will replace a general understanding of the entire concept. They're just two wildly different processes, and they're very different in their efficiencies for learning. The time-saving bias. The tendency to underestimate the time that could be saved when increasing from a relatively low speed, and to overestimate the time that could be saved when increasing from a relatively high speed. Yeah, you just, minor changes get too much weight in decision-making processes. The feasibility isn't thought out. It's wishful thinking. Zero-sum bias, where a situation is incorrectly perceived to be like a zero-sum game, meaning there's only a limited number of success in the world. And if I have some, it means that someone else doesn't get any, which ignores the possibility that successful people are able to take what they have and convert it into more success than they have, which ergo would make sense that you can make more success. Maybe not everybody can make more success, but that's a different problem from saying there's a limited amount of success. There's a limited amount of people who are capable of making success. That perhaps is a better focus, which is not possible when zero-sum bias is part of the equation. If you want to test that, try defending any position that has to deal with making people more capable of success, and find the weird and strange ways that you get attacked for that. It's not very good for business if people are better at that. All right, prospect theory. The ambiguity effect, the tendency to avoid options for which the probability of a favorable outcome is unknown. I don't know, and I don't want to know. I'm going to leave well enough alone. We better not fuck around with that. Disposition effect, the tendency to sell an asset that has accumulated in value and resist selling an asset that has declined in value. Yeah, I used to own this when it was worth more. I don't want to lose. Or I don't want to give up the thing that has value to me, which is why people have a hard time sharing ideas. Now, honestly, from every perspective, those ideas have value. That value feels diminished the more accurately that perspective is gained. The endowment effect, the tendency for people to demand much more to give up an object than they would be willing to pay to acquire it. Yeah. I don't want, it's worse to lose than it is to get, is the endowment effect. I would rather get new things than lose something I have. Even if I need those things from you. And even if the thing I'm giving up is respect. Loss aversion, where the perceived disutility of giving up an object is greater than the utility associated with acquiring it. It wouldn't be worth the effort. That's loss aversion. The pseudo-certainty effect, the tendency to make risk-averse choices if the expected outcome is positive, but to make risk-seeking choices to avoid negative outcomes. Yeah, it's the outcome taints the level of risk you're willing to take. If it's a positive outcome, then you're willing to risk less than you are to avoid a negative outcome, because as shown above, we care more about avoiding negative things than we do about acquiring positive ones, which is why communication is so hard for some people. They're so focused on the negatives that they know are built into communication that the positive capacity for what could be gained is thrown out in a pseudo certainty effect. It's better to risk nothing than to risk feeling bad by trying and not getting it right. Status quo bias, tendency to prefer things to stay relatively the same. Yeah, that's the ignorance of entropy. That's a denial of blindness of entropy. Fix it. Things change, they die. If they're staying the same and they're getting worse and you don't see it, that's what it means if something stays the same. It's dying and you can't see how. System justification, the tendency to defend and bolster the status quo, existing social, economic, and political agreements, blah, blah, blah. The Bill of Rights, yeah, system justification. That's a good one. The Golden Rule, system justification. Some of those things make sense and some of them don't, social contract, etc. To put the system above all other systems is to ignore that the system exists to do a thing, which is not to serve itself. So if the system doesn't measure itself and its utility along with everything else, it becomes a bias. A self-assessment, the Dunning-Kruger effect, the tendency for unskilled individuals to overestimate their ability, and the tendency for experts to underestimate their ability.
Yeah, I like this one.
Yeah, this
I
is
studied this one.
pretty
Probably
much
based on your recommendation.
the Dunning-Kruger effect is a measure of people's awareness to complexity. And if something is simple, that means that you are simple when it comes to understanding it. And if something is complicated, because you're an expert, you become complicated when you are understanding it. So it is a map of the complexity of your limits and how complex you can go. So yes, you are correct when you are estimating the complexity of your opinion. If you are unskilled, you are very good at estimating that assessment of your own competence because it's very simple. You can do that with confidence. And the expert can't because there are too many questions that they know are relevant that have not yet been answered. So the person who is assuming things can move along is missing dimensions of understanding that the expert has not. And the expert will be far less likely to proclaim certainty when they know that probability is a better explanation of what's going on. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. A hot-cold empathy gap, the tendency to underestimate the influence of visual drives on one's attitudes, perspectives, and behaviors. Yes, if you have a feeling, it limits what you can perceive and amplifies what you can perceive. And if you have the same situation and a different feeling, it limits what you can perceive and amplifies what you can perceive. And they're complementary. You know, they're focuses. Feelings are focuses. They're narrowings of perspective into coalescing experiences. So yeah, you can't ignore that that's going to be positive. Oh, people will choose this because of blank, but they forgot that it's light green, and nobody likes light green. But it does all this stuff. They don't care. It's the wrong color. But it's going to cure it. It doesn't matter. It's the wrong color. That's the ignorance of the hot-cold empathy gap. That's a rejection of logical response and an unwillingness to correct it because it, air quotes, shouldn't be relevant. That's where the hot-cold empathy gap comes from. The hard-easy effect, the tendency to overestimate one's ability to accomplish hard tasks and underestimates one's ability to accomplish easy tasks. Yeah, if you want to run into the hard-easy effect, try to build a table. Illusion of explanatory depth, the tendency to believe that one understands a topic much better than one actually does. The effect is strongest for explanatory knowledge, whereas people tend to be better at self-assessments for procedural, narrative, or factual knowledge. Yeah, that's the it works when I do it type of response. When it works when I do it is not paired with a separation from self-referencing measurements. That person is full of shit. So you have to watch for that. That's how to tell the difference, is the ability to remove yourself from your own measurements is present in your interactions. If that step is not being taken, you are included in the measurement you're making, but might not be aware of how your emotional state at that moment is affecting the measurements you're taking. The objectivity phenomena, they believe they're more objective and unbiased than other people. Yeah, same kind of deal. Truthiness, the belief bias. In effect, where someone's evaluation of the logical strength of an argument is based on the believability of the conclusion. Yeah, that's nonsense. That's the I don't want to believe it button. The tendency to believe the statement is true if it's easier to process or if it has been stated multiple times. Yeah, that's the 24-hour news cycle. Rhyme as reason. Yeah, rhyming makes things more fun. People believe things that rhyme for some reason. Okay. Subjective value. It's true. It's really true. If you want something to be catchy, make it rhyme. That's why rap works good when people are talking about hard truths. Subjective validation, where statements are perceived as true if a subject's belief demands it to be true. Yeah, that one's great. I love that one. If somebody is throwing out subjective validation, you can hide behind that all day. Hide whatever fact you want behind the validation of the thing they care about, and you can have whatever conversation you want. Because most people aren't checking what the thing they say means. They're just putting it out there because they're supposed to. So if they don't know what it means and you can get them past it, then they haven't done anything that they didn't want to do anyways. So it's really knowing a weird password lock that's supposed to keep the outsiders out with their different ways of thinking. It's the, I need to know how you feel before I'm allowed to be your friend, because once I'm your friend, it's too late for me, because when I care about you, I have to understand you. So that's the protection against that. And the way to get around that is not worry about it, hide behind it. Let their own validation protect you from their bad reasoning. It's what they use it for. Why can't you get the effect until you're close enough to make your point? Action bias. Tendency for someone to act when faced with a problem, even when inaction would be more effective. Yeah, that's a tough one, because there's a law of diminishing opportunity to act whenever situations change. And it is a race to the finish in terms of who is going to be given the greatest reward. Whoever gets it right the fastest wins. But that means you have to get it right. Whoever gets it wrong the fastest usually fails the most catastrophically. So know your limits, know your reach, know who reaches further than you, and have all of them be ready. That's how you get around action bias. It's not knowing what to do, it's knowing who would know what to do. That will determine your success as far as action bias goes. Additive bias, tendency to solve problems through addition, even when subtraction is a better approach. Yeah, here's a silly one. How do you solve the problem of lynching through additive bias? What do you add to that? What do you add to that to make it better? You can't. It's rotten to the core, man. You can't. Now subtract it. You can't add to that and get a result that makes sense. But people say, oh no, we have to keep the existing system. We have to keep this blank. We have to, this can't go away. Well, maybe it needs to. Maybe it's the reason things are bad. That's additive bias, resists that. Attribute substitution, when a judgment has to be made that is complex, and a more easily calculated attribute is substituted. It's thought of taking place in it's like a judgment system rather than a more self-aware. So it's the difference between math and feelings, really. The attribute substitution is the desire to simplify an interaction. That also follows the spectrum. How simple you can make an interaction and how accurate you can keep that parallel determines how fast you'll be able to get there compared to someone else. When you get it wrong, it's attribute substitution. Your metaphor is bad. You got to fix it. Find a different one. The curse of knowledge. Better informed people find it difficult to think about problems from the perspective of lesser informed people. Yeah, that's curse of knowledge indeed. Like that's the victim mentality of smart people. That's the I'm not smart enough to figure out how to be smarter than everyone else and have them tell me I'm smarter than everyone else. Therefore, I'm going to be miserable because that's the only thing that would make me happy, because I can't deal with these less informed people because they're too simple for me. Oh, they're too complicated for you to figure out how to say hello without them getting mad. So maybe this is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Smart guy who's bad at social interaction, who was me for too many years, so I get to say that. Yeah, if talking to other people who aren't as evolved as you are is something that bothers you, you've got work to do on yourself. It's got nothing to do with them. There are different ways to tell if a person is a piece of shit, and how informed they are is not one of them. If everybody was measured by what they don't know, everybody would be a piece of shit, because nobody double checks what they know. So everybody's getting a failing grade if we use that measurement. So find a better measurement than how informed somebody is. Maybe how nice they are. Maybe how patient you are. Those would be good substitutions for how informed someone is. Declinism, the predisposition to view the past favorably and the future negatively. Yeah, well, you and everyone else who liked watching the shows they watched when they grew up and thinks that current TV is garbage. And I can say that no matter what age you are, because that's what happens. Food tastes better. I'll tell you what, all of that stuff is true, but it's true because you're just chasing chemical highs and those things give it to you, and you build up a tolerance over time. So you remember back in the glory days when you had your first hits of that drug and it felt real good because you had not been exposed to it previously. So now previous hits build up a tolerance over time, and you got to find a way to condense and mainline that shit. So the Thundercats isn't enough anymore to say, Thundercats. Now you got to get the music video remake with high definition shaded animation and really crank that thing up full. So what you're doing with that, with nostalgia in general, think of that like a drug tolerance that builds up over time. And it has to do with perspective and expectation. Exaggerated expectation, the tendency to predict more extreme outcomes for those outcomes that actually happen. Yeah, that's drug seeking behavior right there. Again, man, I wanted it to be more. Why did you want it to be more? Because I would have felt it better. Okay. Form function of attribution bias. In human robot interaction, the tendency of people to make systematic errors when interacting with a robot. People may base their expectations and perspectives of a robot or its appearance and attribute functions which do not mirror the true functions of the robot. So if it looks like a person, they'll be more likely to treat it like a person, even though it's just a plastic casing around the same metal box that could also be a flat screen TV. Useful if you want things to be used. Like if you want a telephone station in your little commune town, you would make all of those little stations in the shape of telephones and visible from a distance. That sort of thing would be the function attribution bias. You give things an exaggerated labeling. That's how it happens in person-to-person interaction, but you could use that in different ways, positive ways. Street signs. Yeah, this is Main Street, right? I better act like it's Main Street. Hindsight bias. Yeah, the tendency to see past events as being predictable. Oh yeah, good. The biggest assholes in the world speak up when it's done. Like they didn't watch it with everyone else. The race to action is not the first person to say it was wrong. That's an action bias. Got to do something. It's wrong. All right. Oh, that was close. we got that denunciation out of the way and go on with my life, when everyone else who is not fallen prey to the action bias is like, well, what are we going to do about it? Well, it don't matter. It was wrong. You know it was wrong, right? That's what we could have prevented this all along. I knew it was coming. That's how hindsight bias collides with action bias. Those two work together. Impact bias, the tendency to overestimate the length or the intensity of the impact of future feeling states. This is the most important election we'll have in our entire lives. I've never felt that for more than a few days. There we go. That's on tone for that phrase. The most garbage phrase. You'll hear it every 4 years for the rest of your life. Which means you get more important as you get closer to death, maybe. I don't know. I don't like it. Some of those things are going to turn out better than others. We can't know. Information bias, the tendency to seek information even when it cannot affect action. Yeah, I don't want to answer your question until I know what you're going to do with the information. Okay, like that's information bias right there. You hold the information hostage. Or that's the reverse end of that. That's the information restriction. The information bias is where you want all the information, even if it's not relevant, and has been proven to be not relevant. That's the thing. You can't just say it's not relevant because that can become a fallacy of relevance. But you can say, well, let's get the information, it's relevant or not, and then it becomes clear. Now, this really doesn't have anything to do with it at all, and the burden becomes on you to at least make the connection of relevance ahead of time. That's who wins when information bias comes out. Is they need to be, the person asking for the information needs to be able to answer how it could be relevant when challenged. The introspective bias, or the hungry judge effect, the tendency for sensory input about the body to affect one's judgment about external unrelated circumstances. Yeah, when you're in a good mood, you do good mood things. The judge is more lenient after lunch. You're hungry. Why don't you have a Snickers? The money illusion, the tendency to concentrate on the nominal value of money rather than its purchasing power. You see that one in the news all the time. Stuff is getting more expensive. No, stuff is not getting more expensive, not in the way that you're thinking about it. A gallon of gas has the same energy content it did 1 year ago. It has the power to move a vehicle from point A to point B a specific number of miles. It is a thing. It has concrete fixed value. The gasoline in that example is the object of value. The money is the object that exchanges for it. So when the value of a gallon of gas remains the same and the dollar amount taken to purchase that same gallon of gas goes up, your money has become worth less in that exchange because you do not drive 30% farther on a gallon that costs 30% more. Your $10 bill is a $7 bill after 30% inflation. So saying that stuff got more money, stuff became more expensive, is to view that the opposite. It's a loss aversion, and that is a manipulation that the media does, because people don't want to think about their money in terms of how much they've lost. They will avoid that because it's a bias. They will avoid it more reliably than they will avoid, then they will seek the solution that, yes, my money is worth less. I did lose. So the media puts that out there as a blanket statement. Gas is more, meat is more, medicine is more, blank is more. And then what do these people do? Oh, everything's more. Well, my money is the same. I need a raise. But if you get a raise, that's not going to change that the fact that your money is just going to be worth less again in the future, unless you're getting a raise that outpaces inflation. How much your money is worth should be the focus, not how much of it you get per hour. Anyone who's played a video game knows that when the score gets too high, you just add a zero. You add a new letter of the alphabet. You change the scale. The gameplay stays the same difficulty. So that's how you recognize where you are in the game, by recognizing that the scoreboard needs to be read in reverse. Moral credential effects occurs when somebody who does something good gives himself permission to be less good in the future. Yeah, well, I gotta say, like if I help a group full of kids clean up something, and then the next day, that same group of kids is dumping trash on the lawn, I am not going to help those same group of kids clean up trash again. That's the once bitten, twice shy side of that. Or you could say that you could take the opposite effect of that, the way the church did it. The purchasing of indulgences. Indulgences were a piece of paper you could buy. It was a sin offering to the Catholic Church. Martin Luther King had a problem with these. So you could trade money for sin. You could purchase forgiveness in advance. This is the equivalent of that, moral credential effect. I'm a very good person, therefore it's okay that I do blank. Which is a hard truth for some people. That's something where that's an internal judgment. So that person is going against their own moral code, whereas in a different example, somebody else would be measuring somebody's actions against the moral code outside of that. For example, a moral credential effect could have such a small scale that you would never see it. Say that somebody follows a very strict guideline where they only will walk over the cracks in between the pavement so that they don't break their mama's back. And they do this on their way to church every day. And now they had an extra double shift at the soup kitchen and they're exhausted. And they just look at this pavement and say, man, I just don't have the energy for this right now. I'm sorry, mama. And they take a step and they walk on all of those cracks. And that person says, well, mama's not going to care because I worked at the soup kitchen and I just got off this 8-hour thing at church. And so it's okay for me to step on all these cracks. So that person, from their perspective, has given themselves permission to fail themselves, their normal standard, because they're saying, yes, I didn't hit this metric, but I exceeded these other metrics. And so it does balance out. That's their reasoning for that. Now, when that gets out of whack, when you are the determiner of the value of all morality, okay, that's a different bias. When your own scale of good is everybody's scale of good, now that's a different ball of wax, because now when you give yourself permission to be bad because you were good, you could become the guy that solves world hunger and kills 30% less people than you save. Well, that's not okay. You don't get permission to say that's okay for everybody to be a part of that system. The people who are getting ground up and fueling it might have a problem with that. But if you say, well, I'm so good and my way is so right, that those people need to be okay with getting ground up. That's when you realize, well, you have the moral credential effect going on, and you have become something that probably is going to get put down at some point, just because that's how society works. Non-adaptive choice switching. After experience a bad outcome with the decision, the tendency to avoid the choice previously made. Yeah, it didn't work out when I did it last time. It negates every possibility that the reason it turned out wrong is because you did it wrong and experienced it wrong rather than you tried the wrong thing. You had the right tool, you maybe even made the right choice, but your direction was wrong, your timing was wrong. But non-adaptive choice switching is, well, I already tried it once that way. So you throw out the entire category of tools in that set. Like for example, my first marriage is a good one. This was when I was less emotionally aware when I was in my first marriage. And one of the things that we didn't do well was communicate. So the marriage broke down over time because our different levels of craziness didn't play nice with each other naturally. We weren't lucky enough to have that. So the times where we could have worked on it together as a couple to find peace and stability were ignored by both of us. We didn't know how to do it. So I go through all of this, and this marriage declines and declines and declines, and then it's gone. Okay, that happens. So now I'm looking back, and years later, I can see how certain qualities that were positive in the first marriage were qualities that I had stopped looking for in other people. Good qualities, qualities that were present in this person that were not bad. But because those good qualities were tied to this bad experience, and because those qualities were recognized in the moment, when the entire experience went bad, assumptions that it is good to look at a person that way and see what good quality they have, that was thrown out as valuable. And that was a non-adaptive choice switching. Oh, I tried somebody who was good at that. It didn't matter. Too simplistic. It's a yes and, not an either or. So that was, it's the potential to throw away good things that are too close to bad things. The baby with the bathwater. You didn't chop it up enough before you put it in the trash. There were things that could have been reused and recycled that weren't garbage. More mere exposure effect, the tendency to express undue liking for things merely because of a familiarity with them. Yeah, that's the yeah. I know about this, so I'm excited about it. That's a feeling of power, is how Nishi would put that. Being intoxicated with your own expertise to the point where you can't lose it. That's the mere exposure effect. Yeah, I'm not going out of my comfort zone effect. Omission bias, the tendency to judge harmful actions as worse or less moral than equally harmful inactions. So yeah, you would say that somebody who does an act is worse than somebody who doesn't do an act and something bad happens. Now that one's loaded with whatever story you want to tell about who was good and bad. If you want to get to the heart of it, omission bias is the story of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life and original sin in the Garden of Eden. That's the proper understanding for omission bias. You decide what's good and evil, and then you decide as judge, jury, and executioner who has lived up to good and evil. And then you also become the arbiter of which sins are worse and to which degree. That's omission bias, when it says doing a thing is worse than not doing a thing. Optimism bias, tendency to be overly optimistic, underestimating greatly the probability of undesirable outcomes and overestimating favorable outcomes. Yeah, that one is the only way to tell the difference between optimism and confidence is the level of follow through. So you have to measure it over time. If someone makes an extraordinary claim, they need to back it up with an extraordinary result. If you do that, making promises you don't know how to keep, that could be an optimism bias. If you're very good at mental trajectory, maybe you can use your optimism as a better measurement than a bias and say, I don't know how to do this now. I have X amount of time before now and then. There's a good chance I could learn enough to keep a promise that I don't know how to keep if I needed to fulfill it right now. So I'm going to use all of my time and keep the promise in the allotted amount of time I have. And that's a different kind. That's not a bias. That's more of a accurate assessment of what you're capable of. But if you miss the mark on that and you find yourself getting things half done, that's an optimism bias, assuming it would be easier than it would. The ostrich effect, ignoring an obvious negative situation. Yeah, there's a lot of those. I like to pull things from the news. So there's a few news cycles going around. I hit the Chris Rock one last time. I've seen a lot of people spreading this one. There's a photo of the swimming competition for first, second, and third place. Apparently this thing happened at the Olympics. I didn't watch the Olympics, but it was the girls' swimming event, and the first person was on the first place podium, and the second and third place people were sharing almost a single podium, and they were protesting the competition status of the first place winner. And so that was an ostrich effect to certain individuals who are sensitive to the participation status of the first place winner. They don't want to look fully at how that ripples through the second, third place, and the lower levels of the sport, et cetera, because it would make the overall status of that competitor come into question in a way that is unfavorable with something else. So it's what's the word? It's a clash of existing beliefs, and one of them is the winner. And bad things that happen to one of those existing beliefs that is not the winner are minimized and ignored. That's the ostrich effect. Outcome bias. tendency to judge a decision by its eventual outcome instead of the quality of the decision at the time it was made. Yeah, what does the scoreboard say? That's outcome bias. Time and a place for that. Why did the scoreboard say that? Time and a place for that too. Make sure that it's not just a blind pick. You gotta know why, or at least know what's relevant to know why when you're using outcomes to measure anything. Otherwise, you'll commit outcome bias. Pessimism bias, a tendency for some people, especially those suffering from depression, to overestimate the likelihood of negative things happening to them. Yeah, that Murphy's Law, something bad can go happen, it will. I'm going to tell you something about optimism and pessimism. Pessimism is a safer bet. Pessimism is a safer bet because you're dumber than an optimist would need to be to have ideal success all the time. However, that's only if you're measuring pessimism on what it means to have a negative effect happen to you. So negative things are going to happen to you all the time. It is how you perceive the experience of negative events that determines whether you have an optimism or pessimism bias. If you only see the bad things as the sum total of things that happen to you, and if you only see bad things as things not happening the way you intended, well, then of course you're going to be wrong all the time. Because if it was even money, the house always wins because entropy takes a tax and skews the data in a direction of what you thought was true at the time is now not correct because it is changed by devolution over time. So even your best guess needs to be a guess that can adapt. Otherwise, the house odds are against you, which is why multiple measurements are need to be taken over time, course corrections, etc. Pessimism bias ignores all that. It says it's either good or it's bad from the start. There's no course correction. Optimism bias too. No course correction. It's missing evolution through time in both instances. That's how you fix that. It's allowed to be present in the moment, but it needs to evolve over time and throughout the equation. The present bias, the tendency to give stronger weight to payoffs that are closer to the present when considering trade-offs between two emotions. Yeah, I got this thing that'll pay off in 2 weeks and this thing that'll pay off in 2 years. Well, if the thing in 2 weeks is going to pay off the same amount that it would pay off in 2 years, well, then it's better to take the money now. If the thing that pays off in 2 years is 10,000 times greater than the thing that pays off in 2 weeks, well, the difference between $100 and 2 weeks and 100 times 10,000 in 2 years would be present bias. And if you would say, well, I'm not going to need that money in 2 years, I'd rather have the groceries now, then that is a present bias, which puts a very short-term gain over a long-term, much more preferential goal. That's how I feel voting is done in this country. Plant blindness, the tendency to ignore plants and their environment, and the failure to recognize and appreciate the utility of plants to life on Earth. Somebody put that in there. Somebody felt really bad about plants. Better make sure the plants are covered. All right, there's people who don't care about plants. Prevention bias. Yeah, if plants are relevant to what you're doing, you should care about them. I think that'll make that person happy. Prevention bias. When investing money to protect against risks, decision makers perceive that $1 spent on prevention buys more security than $1 spent on timely detection and response. Yeah, that's the I don't want problems to ever happen bias. That is the I don't need to handle this problem as it occurs. That is the I want to be done with this once type of thinking. That's a rejection of entropy at its core. Set it and forget it doesn't exist, and prevention bias is a manifestation of that. I don't want to be in charge of that for the rest of time. That's prevention bias. Probability matching, suboptimal matching of the probability of choices when the probability of reward in a stochastic context. Let me see if they have a better definition for that. Probability matching is a decision strategy in which predictions of class membership are proportional to the class base rates. Thus, a training set of positive examples are observed 60% of the time, and negative examples are observed 40% of the time. Okay, all right, that makes more sense. So what you're saying is that if I play this game and it has a 25% chance of me winning, then you will not look at the cost that goes into playing that game the same way that you would look at the cost that comes out of winning that game. You would look at the 5 times reward or the 4 times reward, even though it's a 25% odds or whatever the breakdown would be. And the probability matching would be to look at that over time and see what the better move is rather than the single use of that credit. So the probability matching is a blindness to what events are most likely to occur over time. Pro-innovation bias, the tendency to have excessive optimism towards an invention or innovation's usefulness throughout society, while often failing to define its limitations or weaknesses. Yeah, this will do everything. Do everything and make your breakfast. What's the cost? Yeah, that's the thing. It's only going to cost you an arm and a leg. Maybe some radium poisoning while we paint the watch dials with this fancy new glowing paint. I don't know. Maybe some weird mutations. But it's new. It's going to fix everything. Got to believe in it. Projection bias, the tendency to overestimate how much our future selves share our current preferences, thoughts, values, and ideas. That's a problem for future Tom. Future Tom will be okay with this. It's a shirking of responsibility bias, it's projection bias. It is the someone else should handle this for me, and I will screw anyone who doesn't, even if I am the person that is in charge of this. Proportionality bias, our innate tendency to assume that big events have big causes. Yeah, sometimes it's little. You know, you ever see somebody completely fly off the handle and destroy their life over a 1-sentence comment? Like to the point where they don't come back? Where they go to jail or worse? Small cause, big blow up. But then, well, you got to go deep. Oh, maybe that person had a bad life or this and that, and let's try to explain the whole thing. They just had a really bad day too. That's part of it. They couldn't handle it. Everybody, let's see, the Joker in Batman says everybody's one bad day away from being a criminally insane person. And the question isn't who is and who isn't, it's how bad of a day would it take. I think there's some truth to that. Mostly with people who've never asked that question. If you've never asked yourself the question of what would it take to push you over the edge, there's an answer to that question that's probably closer than you think. The only way to move that needle is to explore it. Recency illusion, the event that if you've noticed recently, greater importance. I think that's the thing where you're liable to pay attention to something more because you just learned about it. I just heard this new word, and now this new word is popping up everywhere. Maybe the word was everywhere, and you just are now noticing it, and previously you were blocking it out. Systemic bias discerns judgment that arises when targets of differentiating judgments become subject to effects of regression that are not equivalent. Yeah, you combine things that don't work together. You mix data sets that don't measure the same thing. How many 3G towers do I need for this city based on the number of Wendy's restaurants that are going to be setting up? You might be able to find an equation somewhere that takes the existing Wendy's locations and produces a decent map of coverage that could do that. You could fit the equation to give the answer it needs, but that is doing it in reverse. That's what a systemic bias looks like. I'm going to do these things, and I'm going to keep changing my own bias against my methods until it produces the result I want. Yeah, it's being averse to challenging your own process. That's a systemic bias, a disgust sensitivity with how things are done. And that goes in both directions, how things are done poorly and how things are done well. If the conversation is ever missing one or both of those elements, an unbalanced view of the system itself is being talked about. Unless the old system is being thrown away entirely, in which case it ought not be referenced at all in favor of a brand new construction of something to replace it. So that is where systemic bias comes into play when changes are being made. There's a lack of deconstruction and rearrangement over time because the systems themselves are not challenged. They're considered singular and indivisible. So that's how systemic bias becomes trapped in itself. Oh, system's bad. And bad compared to what? Well, it's bad at this. Okay, what's it good at? Well, it's bad at this. Fine, it's bad at that too. What's it good at? Well, it's bad at this and that. Okay, so we get the list of 40,000 things you think it's bad at. I'm not stopping until we also get the list of things it's good at. Okay, running water. Flushing toilets. Infrastructure. Groceries. Heat. Cooling. Hospitals that don't murder you with 100% effectiveness. 80-year life expectancy in some places. All of those things are true. Systemic bias ignores that. Risk compartmentalization, the tendency to take greater risks when perceived safety increases. Yeah, whoever deserves, what was it? He who wants liberty at the expense of safety deserves neither. No, he who wants liberty at the expense of freedom deserves neither. Something along those lines. It was Ben Franklin quote, security at the expense of freedom. Yeah, something like that. But that's true. When people will take a risk to prevent something from bad happening. Yeah. Surrogation, losing sight of the strategic construct that a measure is intended to represent, and subsequently acting as though the measure is the construct of interest. Yeah, it's like when you really want to talk about radishes and you're having a big conversation about farms. People do that emotionally. People want to talk about rejection and validation and abandonment and feeling isolated, but they talk about politics and religion instead. And when they don't know how to do it, those conversations go poorly. Parkinson's law of triviality, the tendency to give disproportionate weight to trivial issues, also known as bike shedding. The bias explains why an organization might avoid specialized or complex subjects, such as the design of a nuclear reactor, and instead focus on something easy to grasp to the average participant, such as the design of an adjacent bike shed. That's the this is too smart for you when you're going to get torches and pitchforks if I don't dumb it down. That's the mindset of that of that bias. Unconscious bias or implicit bias. Biases that people don't know they have. Yeah, that list is as long as the list we've covered. People like to narrow that list down to 2 or 3 things. Those things are on there, and so are all of these other ones. And if your focus is on narrowing that list to 1 or 2 specific things, there are other biases on this list that you are committing at the same time. Broaden your scope. There's room. Your brain isn't going to run out. You can fit the thing you care about and the thing everyone else can understand too. And they're going to smush each other out. Room for both. Yeah, so we make quick judgments based on our experience and our memories, and it can do everything from gender, color, type of vehicle, food, flavors, sunshine, wind, rain, everything. Everything that makes you feel a thing is subject to unconscious bias, which is a different way of saying you'll either want it or you'll want to be away from it. And that's different for everybody based on what they come into contact with. Unit bias, the standard suggested amount of consumption is perceived to be appropriate, and a person would consume it even if it's too much. Yeah, so how much am I supposed to take? Somebody else make the decision for moderation. I can take all of it or none of it. That's a lack of duality that makes that bias. The need for specificity. The difficulty in comparing small differences in large quantities. Yeah, the difference between a million and a million and one. Well, $1,000,001 and 1,000,001 feathers, 1,000,001 atoms. I don't know, 1,000,001 seconds. Women are wonderful effect. Tendency to associate more positive attributes to women than with men. That's a biased thing right there. Someone feeling bad put that up there. The tendency, that's just a different bias. Sure, whatever you need to say is biased to make you feel good on that one. That's a thing. But it's covered by all the other biases without putting a specific gender to it. It's just incomplete. That's why it bothers me. The men are wonderful effect. The men are pigs effect. The women are bitches effect. The men are loud effect. The men are angry effect. The blank, it's fill in the blank, man. This entry is too small for this page for it to be complete. It just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. Association. These are social fallacies. Association, authority bias. Greater accuracy to the opinion of an authority figure. We did that in the fallacies. The cheerleader effect, we did that. The halo effect, we did that when we did fallacies. The actor observer bias, the tendency for explanations of other individuals' behaviors to overemphasize the influence of their personality and underemphasize the influence of the situation. Yeah, here's why I was the hero of that story. That's the actor observer bias. Here's why I was the person who made the difference. And everyone else was a bit player in my story, except for this villain who caused all the problems that we're going to be mad about. The defense attribution hypothesis, a tendency to attribute more blame to a harm doer as the outcome becomes more severe. Yeah, the worse it turns out, the more blame we need to find. The extrinsic incentives bias, an expectation to the an expectation to the fundamental attribution error where people view others as having more motivations. Fuck you guys. Okay, this bias is the one where you assume somebody else is bad because they don't want what you want and they have an ulterior motive. All right, fuck you guys. That was way too hard. Somebody else doesn't want to play the game the way you do, and you're not going to play until you're sure they feel the same way. That's that bias. Moving on. Fundamental attribution error, the tendency for people to overemphasize personality-based explanations for behaviors. I want to take away as much of the group dynamic of this as possible. So it's the tribalism in reverse. It's what happens when someone in your tribe does a thing your tribe doesn't like, and you need to kick them out immediately. Here's why they didn't belong. And that goes as deep as the blame needs to go. The group attribution error, that's the same thing in reverse. The belief that characteristics of an individual group member are reflective of the group as a whole. Tendency to assume that this group decision reflects the outcome of the preference of the group members. Yeah, so if you have 10 people that are in a room and say that 8 people are of one ethnicity and 2 people are of another ethnicity, if one of those people who are the 2 people needs to know what's going on culturally, they can whisper to one of their other friends for an explanation. And whoever has the greater numbers has the more intimate representation of that knowledge from their perspective. And you can paint that scenario in whatever direction you need to, fill in the colors, as it were, choose your own adventure at that point. I'll let you be the hero and whomever be the villain by leaving the colors blank in my example. The just world hypothesis, to believe that the world is fundamentally just, causing them to rationalize inexplicable injustice. Yeah, bad things happen because other people must be bad. Things would turn out right if we didn't have all these people ruining it. Moral luck, the tendency for people to ascribe greater or lesser moral standing based on the outcome of an event. Yeah, it turned out well, so I must have been right. There's some truth to that. Just because you're right and you have no idea why doesn't mean you can't take the win. But it doesn't mean that you should count on the outcome to be able to repeat itself. Realizing when you succeeded by plan and realizing when you succeeded by luck is just as important as realizing when you failed because of a plan and when you failed because of bad luck. Puritanical bias, tendency to attribute cause of an undesirable outcome or wrongdoing by an individual to a moral deficiency or lack of self-control. Yeah, that was the, we need to find the evil sinner who ruined my plan because my plan is above reproach. Self-serving bias, claiming more responsibility for successes than failures. Yeah, I'm on your team when you're winning. And as long as my team is winning and I'm on it, I'm going to do things that help my team. Maybe this report that has some less than flattering information in it will find its way to the doorstep of this other influential person, because if that person were to become publicly discredited, that would be good for me. Or maybe this bad information that has come out about somebody that I care about and has been brought to light when it was previously hidden. Well, that makes my team look really bad, so maybe I should hide that. That's the self-serving bias. That's everywhere, and it can be bought. Everybody who takes money for making decisions is involved with a self-serving bias.
When is that a good thing?
What's that?
When is that a good thing? So the way I process things is, however I'm supposed to learn, I try to learn the other way. So with everything, this fallacies, even especially religious stuff, I hate it when religious people say things I agree with and I can't find flaws in, because I feel like I haven't learned anything.
Okay. Were you trying to learn that it wasn't a religious idea? I said, were you trying to learn it wasn't a religious idea?
No. This doesn't have to do with the religion of it.
No,
but
that reaction is what I was questioning.
Oh. Well, I say I hate it because I usually don't converse with religious people to find agreement.
All right. Well, you said that you agree with them and you didn't learn anything. I'm just curious.
That's it. If I agree with them, then it's unlikely I learned anything, because in order for me to learn and process, it involves me going through it involves me solving the Rubik's Cube. If you give me a fully solved Rubik's Cube, I'll say it's truth, but it likely won't have much application for me. So I don't have to.
You don't move the squares around once it's solved.
Yeah, if I don't have to solve it and it just is, then I might quote it if it's ever relevant, but it's probably not.
How do you build it? That's the exercise you like to see.
Yeah, if I don't build it myself, it's hard for me to accept it.
Well,
but I mean, that's how everyone is. It's just how strong are your.
You got to break it apart, because then you know what it looks like after one break, and then you put it back, and then you do it again and put it back. And so
the last bias we went to was, I think, the money bias or the self-serving bias.
Yes.
So when is that a good thing? And not in the traditional way, because of course I think we both know the traditional way is if you pay for somebody, you want them to agree with you, or
the self-serving bias, that is a positive force when the goal of the person being served is a goal that benefits the people they are serving. So whereas self-serving bias, so they are achieving their goal and succeeding wildly, but when their goal is purchased and changed in a direction that is counter to what is good for the people they're serving, then it's a bad manifestation, an abuse of trust.
Are you done, Michelle? Okay. My daughter's doing her homework. Sorry, I'll mute this. You can keep going.
Okay. Like a lot of this stuff I'm seeing, trying to figure out if there's enough here to do another episode, and I don't think there is. I think this will be the last one. I'm just going to cover a few more here while we go down with the last 5 minutes. Bandwagon effect is everybody else thinks it's true, so I'm going to think it's true. Social desirability, yeah, you can't say certain things. Ignoring certain statistics because they point in certain directions because they're unpopular, yeah. That's a big one. You see that all over the place. Da, 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 da. Social comparison, the tendency when making decisions to favor potential candidates who don't compete with one's own particular strengths. Yeah, that's the, if I have 10 people and I know that I stack up nice compared to 2 of them, I'm going to want those 2 people to be the last one standing along with myself, regardless of who the best person for the job may be. You're just measuring yourself relative to everyone else. Worse than average effect, a tendency to believe ourselves worse than others at tasks which are difficult. Yeah, it's not, you're not failing because you're a failure. You're failing because it's hard, and almost nobody succeeds without extensive training. You're breaking through the myth of the Curry-Dunner effect at that point. Difficult things are hard. You can't easily beat those trained professionals, that sort of thing. False memory. Imagination is mistaken for memory. Yeah, that's a good one. Put anything you want in there. Source confusing. Yeah, confusing episodic memories with other information. You're blending stories.
Episodic, just episodes.
Yeah, like say for example, you have 3 scenes in a hospital and there is a bird painting in the first scene, and you retell the story later about when you got your cancer diagnosis and it was reversed. You're at home, you might remember the bird painting in your hospital room, as opposed to in the room that you walked through to get to your hospital room. That is an example
Gotcha.
of that. Things are closely related but not properly organized. The bizarreness effect. Bizarre material is better remembered than common material. I use that. You get somebody's attention if something is bizarre but harmless. Boundary extension. Remembering the background of an image as being larger and more expansive as the foreground. Yeah, you have to keep your scales relative. The cross race effect. The tendency for people of one race to have difficulty identifying members of a race other than their own. Well, that's just an extension of how shadows and light work and how we 3D map things over time. 3D mapping is a hard process, and light, color, and tone have a lot to do with topology. That's how we understand depth. And so exposure to a certain structure, even though it shares similar structures with different shading, will take more time to acclimate. So yeah, that one makes perfect sense. Even AI has a hard time with it. They have facial recognition software, and all you have to do is put a couple triangles on your face and they can't tell who you are. Egocentric bias. Yeah, remembering yourself as the hero. The euphoric recall, the tendency to remember past experiences in a positive light. The humor effect. Humorous things are more, if it's funny, it's easier to remember. I've told some good jokes in my day. Good luck remembering all of them, because most of them are the ones that poke fun at people and they want to laugh and forget them. So yeah, telling jokes that I have, my jokes almost fade. They're like these weird little memory bugs that just devolve. It's like the ice bullet. It leaves a hole, but it melts away over time. Memory inhibition. Being shown some items from a list makes it harder to retrieve the other items. Yeah, that one's the modality. Memory recall is higher for the last items of a list. Yeah, that's true. End on a positive note, right? The peak end rule. People seem to perceive not the sum of an experience, but the average of how it was at its peak. Yeah, how much was it? What was the highs? What was the lows? Did it end appropriately? What was the fun over and then the event dragged on? People will remember that just as much as if the event ended right at the best part or right before the best part. You don't want that to happen. Saying is believing. Communicating a socially tuned message to an audience can lead to a bias of identifying the tuned message as one's own thoughts. Yeah, that's good marketing and branding. You don't want to be a xenophobe. You don't want to be a Trumper. You don't want to be a liberal. They're bad. And you know how I can tell you they're bad? I'm going to play some music that's going to stimulate the fight or flight centers of your brain. And then I'm going to run some slow motion footage, which is going to trigger your visual cortex to focus on that because there's more detail there. So now you are in a hyper aware state of intense attention to detail and therefore intense relevance. By comparison, they're going to introduce something that is true next to something that is visually and auditorily unsettling. And after a 24-hour news cycle, saying is believing. That's how those ideas get put into people's thoughts and heads, which is why the terminology is very carefully chosen and distributed across nationwide channels. Every Fox News station uses the same phrases to describe a thing. Every CNN station uses the same phrases to describe a thing. Guess what? All of the news stations use the same phrase to describe a thing because they are all selling the same message from different perspectives, so that the message is argued over and the perspective is accepted as a normal dynamic. Saying is believing because nobody's changing it. So I'm just looking here. Oh, we did make it to the end of the list after skipping a few. What was the last one? The Zeigarnik effect. The uncompleted or interrupted tasks are remembered better than other ones. Oh yeah, like if you get halfway through the movie and the power gets out, versus you get halfway through the movie and you get bored. One of them is going to prompt you to action a lot more than the other. You're really going to want to know. So I think that's everything. We got all these C alsos here. These C alsos were also part of it. So let me just run through here. My next step is to ask Tony if there's any questions. Chronostasis, the distortion in the perception of time. Cognitive distortion, exaggerated, or these are actually pretty good ones. Cognitive distortion, exaggerated or irrational thought pattern. Anecdotal evidence, evidence relying on personal testimony. Cross-race effect, cognitive bias, a defense mechanism, unconscious psychological mechanism that reduces anxiety from negative stimuli. Yeah, you say a thing, it's words, and people don't like it, you will find out what their defense mechanisms are, which is usually their greatest, strongest attacks, which is the things that they are the most threatened by and therefore feel would be good to use against you if the goal was to make you uncomfortable and to back off. So they give you the weapons that would hurt them. That's how defense mechanisms work. If you're skilled at mental martial arts, you can then take those weapons and hurt them with them, and then take them away from them, and then show them how to play with those weapons properly, and then give them back to them. Because nothing is more demoralizing than having your weapon taken from you, being beaten soundly with it, and then having that weapon given back to you with the full encouragement to use it again. But you got to really know what you're doing to make that work. Otherwise, you're just an asshole. You talk fast. So you have to beat them by the rules they understand and agree to ahead of time. Otherwise, you're the hero.
It's easy to be an asshole.
What's that?
I said it's real easy to just be an asshole.
It sure is. You got to really do your measuring if you're going to be right. Otherwise, you're just going to think you're right. The observer effect, the difference between a measured quality and its true value, blah, blah, blah. Pollyanna principle, there we go. Tendency of people to remember pleasant events more than unpleasant ones. We covered that one. Block out the bad stuff. That's not true, though. The Pollyanna effect is just all that's left is your good memories and parts of them, because all of your bad memories have taken parts of your good memories with them as well. So the Pollyanna principle is recognizing that your spectrum has eroded, if you look at it that way. Propaganda, form of communication intended to influence an audie's views or attitudes. That's all communication. Hello? The goal of information is to do that. Propaganda is the professional version of it. It has a negative connotation, manipulative undertones. But you could say that I have a propaganda to make you understand this sentence while I'm speaking it, and I will go to extraordinary lengths to try and meet that goal, providing an appropriate visual, providing an appropriate audio cue, something relevant. It is when those tools are used for good or evil that you start to see things that happen in the news all the time, where people are made to believe literal things are relevant that don't exist to mask atrocities that are happening or other things that maybe need to be handled, which looks similar in terms of what solution would be required, but the reasoning is farly removed from any sort of process that the population gets to know. So that's fallacies and bias. That was supposed to be a 1-episode thing that turned into a 4-episode. Was it 5? I think it was 4. Either way, it was too many. We're gonna edit that down. So do you have any, that was fun to do at the beginning, but it kind of got boring toward the end where it was just a list. I'll be glad to get back to my normal format, and the editing process will be very kind to this section.
I think the biases were harder than the fallacies.
They are.
And because of that, maybe putting them first would help fix that. I think it works better, and it would be better. And I think it's knowledgeably better fallacies and then biases.
So
However, for the
there's,
people that are like us,
yeah,
I think putting the biases first will cause more confusion, which will help learning and keep the, you know, keep it flowing. Yes, you can have water.
so
I
if
think
I
it'll keep it
challenge the
flowing to put the
dichotomy
biases
there
first.
and raise you, I'll challenge the dichotomy and raise you um, the interactive nature of fallacies and bias and how they dance with each other. What I think would be the most effective method of use would be to remove the chapters of fallacy and bias directly, or at least initially, and take the tiny little comments and split them in where they're relevant with the rest of the conversations at whole. So it
I
almost
think
becomes
that
like a
would be
Beekman's
quite
world of like
difficult.
factoid definition.
I think that would be quite difficult
But you just have to know where
because,
they apply.
well, the thing is, the concepts we're working through, everything, the goal is, I believe, in not so many words, listen to the meaning, not the words, everything should apply everywhere, not absolutely. With that, I feel like not just the fallacies and biases, but a lot of chapters could have vast application to be spread in such a way. Maybe at the end, looking back, that might still be doable, but I think I think the group we're going after, or at least I believe the self-aware, somewhat taught individuals, I think if I think it's important to have it somewhat separate, in a sense, like you said potentially temporary, but I feel like it's already involved in a lot. I think a lot of people who exchange contradictory information with words are already aware of many fallacies, whether it's only in others or in both others and themselves, or information in general.
Yeah, there's no limit to the number of places that this information could find its way in a smooth setting. The scope of the project, I was thinking more of I want to make a thing that is watchable by anybody and can be enjoyed by anybody. And to do that, from my perspective, you have to set up way stations of mental stability. So you need resonance points for all the different energies and perspectives. It's not about maintaining one clear perspective. It's about maintaining enough coherence of a set perspective that someone who is of that set perspective can engage that as an anchor and use it to branch out to other perspectives that are nearby. So as the speaker, my goal then becomes to use a rotating frequency of things at different speeds, which correspond to these different things, and spin all of those plates together into one homogeneous message that sounds strange on its own from any one of those perspectives, however, does succeed at its goal of aligning the attitudes, directions, and topics in such a way that everybody hears the same lecture or very close to it.
And I don't believe that's possible. Look at some of the ancient books we've read or the self-help books we've read that's had those same purposes. I still clearly read all of those texts from the filter of their target audience because it's not everybody. It's
So
always as many as possible.
Right.
Because to do everybody would be, I mean, who but God, if there is such a person, knows, the vast. I mean, even the other day in the messages, when me and Ken almost got into it a little bit, I said whenever people talk about people, it always shows me not anything about people. It shows me how the people you surround yourself by have affected your perception, or how you see people isn't the same thing as saying how people are. So,
yeah, so what I
appealing
need to
to
be aware of,
everybody.
for the scope of my project, then what I need to be aware of is that my limitation will be how much I understand how to communicate different types of people at a fundamental level. And
Well,
the level that I
newspapers are
can
written.
understand that will determine the amount of people that I can fix. If we,
Newspapers are written on a third grade reading level.
what's that?
Newspapers are written on a third grade reading level.
Yes.
This is not third grade
No,
reading level market to masses type material.
I
So
don't talk about this material. See, I think you're running into a privilege of vocabulary that you have with me. The way that I discuss these concepts with you is not the language I use to discuss these concepts with other people who communicate at a third grade reading level.
but the goal is to, correct? Is the goal to eventually?
The goal here is to put everything that I understand about the way that the brain works into one organized format. That's the overall goal.
Got it. And
Whatever it
then we
becomes
can
after
redo it the
that.
next time. Or
But much of that I feel is
That's cool.
transferable because the way that I understand it, you can do some pretty cool stuff with. And where you fall down is also where you excel, is when you understand a thing, you understand it well. So for you, I have to rely on attention to detail to get great truth to stick, at least from my perspective. When I'm communicating with someone else, I can substitute trust and faith in the process that they're more willing to give me to fill in the parts that don't make sense logically. And I say, if you try it this way, tell me what happens. After they try and they figure out what happens, the explanation of how that happened becomes easy for them to accept. So it's the order of cause and effect. So I skip a lot of steps depending on what emotional pathways are open. So the less emotionally available somebody is, the more logic, perspective, and definition I need to use to connect, which is how I understand myself, which is why we get along so well.
Agreed. I actually had a good hour or two last night with Duncan around 3 or 4 a.m. He was helping with some music editing stuff, and we got into some spirituality and church stuff and
Yeah.
a little music stuff. And that was cool. But he talked a lot about you and me, and we talked about the three of us and the bomb and the way the energies are moving and the way the energies work between us. And it was a good 4 a.m. It's the most productive time I've spent at 4 a.m. in a long time.
I know the feeling. You got any questions on today's topic, bro?
Nope, today's topic seems good and straightforward. Biases, links together with the knowledge of fallacies with a few extra Tom details in there and concepts and perspective, and we're good to keep marching forward.
Seems like the money one connected with you about the value of money and the value of goods.
That I saw as attributed to the propaganda of capitalism and all that stuff. I see both perspectives as equally valid, but I think it would be beneficial for some to be able to be knowledgeable of the perspective you shared in money, things costing more, or the value of money going down. But I also believe that most people who would make a difference with that information already have that information.
Yeah, those are people with more money than someone who's mad that they don't have money. If you're mad that you don't have money, it means you don't know how to make it. That makes sense. You know how you should be able to make it. You know how you wish you should be able to make it, but you really don't have it put together on how to do a thing and get the money to come out of it.
Means of production.
Yeah, there definitely is a disconnect. And then you have what is that? The Dunner effect?
Krugen, yeah, the Dunner-Krugen.
The Dunner-Krugen effect, where they assume that because money is so simple, even though they don't have it, that it must follow that the things we could do with that money are simple, and they don't see the hell on earth that would happen if their ideas were made the ideas that were the law of the land. Yeah, it's
Yep, so I'm good on today, and I've got a few minutes with the kids before I've got choir rehearsal.
All right.
So I'll see you online in the dojo.
All right, man. Sounds good. Talk to you later.
See ya.